I'm General Mark Milley, and for 20 years, I helped perpetuate the biggest military lie in American history. Today, I'm breaking my silence. The Afghanistan withdrawal wasn't a failure of planning, it was the inevitable result of 2 decades of deliberate deception at the highest levels. What I'm about to tell you will fundamentally change how you see America's longest war. Every progress report, every success story, every reassurance we gave to Congress and the American people, of it was fiction. And I was one of the architects of that fiction. But 3 months before we left Kabul, I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Hidden deep in classified files that only a handful of people had access to, I found documents that revealed the true scope of our deception. Not just optimistic projections or political spin deliberate, systematic lies that cost thousands of American lives and hundreds of thousands of Afghan lives. The document that changed everything was labeled Operation Truth Suppression. Yes, that was the actual code name. It outlined a 20-year strategy to manipulate intelligence reports, suppress negative assessments, and present a false narrative of progress to justify continued military presence and funding. I remember the exact moment I opened that file. It was 2:17 a.m. in my Pentagon office. The building was empty, except for security. I had been reviewing withdrawal logistics when I stumbled across a folder misfiled in the Afghanistan strategy archives. The classification level was so high that even I, as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, needed special authorization to access it. The first page made me nauseous. It was a memorandum from 2003, signed by officials whose names I cannot reveal, but whose positions made their authority unquestionable. The memo was titled Maintaining Operational Narrative Integrity. In plain English, it was instructions on how to lie systematically about our progress in Afghanistan. The document outlined specific quotas for positive reporting. Field commanders were required to report a minimum 70% success rate on all operations, regardless of actual outcomes. Intelligence assessments had to include at least 3 progress indicators for every negative finding. Casualty reports were to be contextualized to minimize public impact. But what shocked me most was discovering my own signature on some of these documents. Reports I had approved, presentations I had given to Congress, briefings I had delivered to presidents, all based on intelligence I now realized had been systematically doctored. For years, I genuinely believed we were making progress. The reports crossing my desk painted a picture of gradual but steady improvement. Afghan security forces were getting stronger, corruption was decreasing, Taliban influence was waning. I repeated these assessments in good faith to Congress, to the media, to the American people. Now I understand why the reality I witnessed during my visits to Afghanistan never quite matched the reports I was receiving in Washington. The soldiers on the ground knew the truth. The intelligence officers in the field knew the truth. But by the time their reports reached the Pentagon, they had been sanitized, optimized, and fundamentally altered. The system was designed to filter out inconvenient truths. Negative assessments were labeled preliminary or requiring further verification. Positive reports were fast-tracked and amplified. Over time, this created an alternate reality where everyone at the top genuinely believed we were winning a war that we were actually losing from day one. I started digging deeper into these files, and what I found was a bureaucratic machine, specifically designed to perpetuate this deception. There were entire departments whose primary function was to massage data, reframe failures as learning opportunities, and ensure that no report reaching senior leadership contradicted the established narrative. The Afghan National Army numbers were completely fabricated. For years, we reported that they had over 350,000 trained soldiers. The real number was closer to 150,000, and of those, perhaps 30,000 were combat ready. The rest existed only on paper, phantom soldiers created to justify continued funding and support. The corruption figures were equally fictional. We consistently reported decreasing corruption levels, when in reality, the situation was getting worse every year. Billions of American taxpayer dollars were being siphoned off through elaborate schemes that we not only knew about, but tacitly allowed because admitting the truth would have undermined the progress narrative. Most disturbing of all were the Taliban strength assessments. For 15 years, we reported that Taliban forces were degraded, demoralized, and on the verge of collapse. Internal documents I found showed that our own intelligence agencies knew the Taliban were actually growing stronger, recruiting more effectively, and gaining popular support in key regions. One document from 2015 particularly haunts me. It was an honest assessment from a CIA station chief in Kabul, warning that the Taliban controlled or contested over 40% of Afghan territory and were rapidly expanding their influence. This report was rewritten 3 times before reaching senior leadership, with the final version claiming that government forces controlled 70% of the country and were successfully containing insurgent activity. The human cost of these lies became clear when I cross-referenced casualty reports with operational assessments. Time after time, we sent American soldiers into situations we knew were likely to fail, but we couldn't acknowledge that knowledge without undermining the broader narrative. Young men and women died, carrying out missions that our own intelligence suggested were doomed from the start. I found records of at least 400 operations over the past 5 years, where field commanders had expressed serious concerns about mission viability, but their warnings were either ignored or reframed as tactical challenges rather than strategic impossibilities. Many of these operations resulted in American casualties that could have been prevented if we had been honest about conditions on the ground. The withdrawal timeline was equally dishonest. For months, we assured the public that we had contingency plans for every scenario. The truth is, our plans were based on the fictional version of Afghanistan we had created in our reports. We planned for withdrawing from a country where the Afghan government was stable, the military was competent, and the Taliban were a diminished force. When reality collided with our delusions, chaos was inevitable. The rapid collapse of Afghan forces wasn't a surprise to anyone who had access to unfiltered intelligence. It was exactly what our field reports had been predicting for years. If anyone had bothered to read past the sanitized summaries, 3 weeks before the final withdrawal, I received a classified brief that finally laid out the unvarnished truth. Afghan forces were likely to collapse within days of our departure. The government had no popular support outside Kabul. The Taliban had been preparing for this moment for years and had already negotiated surrender agreements with most regional commanders. This information existed in our intelligence files, but it had been buried under layers of bureaucratic optimism. The same system that had been filtering out bad news for 20 years had left us unprepared for the inevitable consequences of our own deception. I tried to sound the alarm. I called emergency meetings, demanded honest assessments, insisted on reviewing unfiltered intelligence. But by then, it was too late. The momentum of 20 years of lies had created a reality where telling the truth seemed more dangerous than continuing the deception. The night before we began the final withdrawal, I sat in my office reading through 2 decades of reports. The contrast between what we knew and what we said was staggering. We had created an elaborate fiction and then trapped ourselves inside it. The airport evacuation was chaos because we had never planned for chaos. Our contingency plans assumed an orderly transfer of power to a stable Afghan government that we knew didn't exist. We prepared for a scenario we had invented in our reports rather than the reality our own intelligence had been documenting for years. Watching those final images from Kabul airport, seeing desperate people clinging to aircraft, witnessing the suicide bombing that killed 13 American service members and over 170 Afghan civilians, I knew that every death was partly my responsibility. not because of tactical decisions made in those final days, but because of strategic deceptions maintained over 20 years. The bomber who attacked Abbey Gate had been on our watch lists for months. The intelligence community knew he was in the area and posed a significant threat, but our security posture was based on assessments that consistently downplayed the Taliban's ability to provide security and overstated our own capacity to control the situation. We had convinced ourselves that the Taliban needed us more than we needed them. Our reports suggested they would cooperate with the evacuation because they wanted international legitimacy. The reality, which was documented in suppressed intelligence reports, was that the Taliban saw the evacuation as a humiliating retreat and had every incentive to make it as chaotic as possible. The families of those who died at Abbey Gate deserved to know that their loved ones were killed, not by an intelligence failure, but by an intelligence system designed to suppress inconvenient truths. We had information that could have prevented those deaths, but that information contradicted 20 years of carefully crafted narratives. After the withdrawal, there was a rush to assign blame. Congressional hearings focused on tactical decisions made in the final weeks. Media coverage examined the evacuation procedures and diplomatic negotiations, but the real failure went much deeper than any single decision or policy mistake. We failed because we had created a system that made failure inevitable. When you spend 20 years lying to yourself about the nature of a conflict, you cannot suddenly develop effective strategies based on reality. Our planning was doomed because it was based on fictional premises. The cost of our deception extends far beyond the final evacuation. Over 2,400 American service members died in Afghanistan. Tens of thousands more were wounded, many carrying physical and psychological scars that will last their entire lives. The financial cost exceeded $2 trillion, money that could have transformed American education, infrastructure, and healthcare. But the human cost to Afghanistan is almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates suggest that over 170,000 people died as a direct result of the conflict. Millions more were displaced, traumatized, or impoverished. An entire generation grew up knowing nothing but war, and when that war finally ended, we left them with a collapsed economy and a humanitarian crisis. Many of these consequences were predictable and predicted. Our own intelligence agencies produced reports outlining likely scenarios if we continued on our established path. But these reports were buried, reframed, or ignored because they didn't support the narrative we had committed ourselves to maintaining. The international ramifications are still unfolding. Our allies lost trust in American intelligence assessments and strategic planning. Partners who had committed their own forces based on our assurances now question whether American military and intelligence evaluations can be trusted. The damage to American credibility will take decades to repair. China and Russia watched our departure from Afghanistan with intense interest, learning valuable lessons about American strategic limitations and decision-making processes. They saw that we could deceive ourselves so thoroughly that we became incapable of accurately assessing our own capabilities and prospects. The documents I discovered suggest that similar deception patterns exist in other ongoing conflicts and strategic assessments. The bureaucratic mechanisms that distorted Afghanistan intelligence remain in place, filtering and sanitizing information before it reaches senior decision-makers. I worry that we are setting ourselves up for similar failures in other parts of the world. The same institutional incentives that rewarded optimistic reporting about Afghanistan still exist. The same career pressures that discouraged honest assessments still influence how intelligence is gathered, analyzed, and presented. Congress has initiated investigations into the Afghanistan withdrawal, but most of these focus on tactical decisions rather than the systemic deception that made those tactical failures inevitable. There's been little appetite for examining the deeper institutional problems that created this disaster. The military promotion system rewards officers who deliver positive assessments and successful mission reports. Officers who consistently report problems or question established narratives often find their careers stalled. This creates powerful incentives for commanders to emphasize positive developments and minimize negative trends. Intelligence analysts face similar pressures. Reports that challenge established policies or suggest that current strategies are failing often face additional scrutiny, delay, or requests for revision. Over time, this creates a culture where analysts learn to censor, emphasizing information that supports policy decisions and downplaying contradictory evidence. The classification system makes it nearly impossible for outside oversight to detect these patterns. Most congressional oversight relies on sanitized briefings and summary reports rather than access to raw intelligence. This allows the filtering process to continue, even during supposedly rigorous oversight hearings. I believe the American people deserve to know how badly they were misled. For 20 years, we told them we were making progress when we knew we weren't. We told them their sons and daughters were fighting for achievable objectives when we knew those objectives were impossible. We told them their tax dollars were building a stable Afghanistan when we knew we were funding corruption and incompetence. The question now is whether we have learned anything from this catastrophic failure of institutional honesty. Are we capable of acknowledging the depth of our self-deception, or will we continue to blame tactical failures and individual decisions rather than confronting the systemic problems that made this disaster inevitable? The documents I've seen suggest that the same patterns of wishful thinking and convenient reporting continue in other areas of national security policy. We may be setting ourselves up for future failures by refusing to honestly examine how and why we got Afghanistan so wrong for so long. As I prepare to leave military service, I feel an obligation to speak these truths, even though doing so may damage my reputation and relationships within the defense establishment. The families of those who died in Afghanistan deserve honesty about why their loved ones were sent to fight an unwinnable war based on lies. We told ourselves and each other, the American people deserve to understand how their government can deceive itself so thoroughly that it becomes incapable of making rational, strategic decisions. They deserve to know that the failure in Afghanistan wasn't just about tactics or timing, it was about institutional dishonesty that compromised our ability to see clearly and think rationally about one of the most important conflicts in American history. This is my confession, my attempt at accountability, and my warning. Until we develop institutional mechanisms for confronting uncomfortable truths rather than managing convenient narratives, we will continue to repeat these tragic mistakes. The next time American lives are at stake, we need to choose honesty over optimism, reality over narrative, and truth over institutional comfort. The Afghan files tell a story of systematic deception, institutional failure, and tragic consequences. But they also tell a story about the importance of truth-telling in a democracy. When institutions lose the capacity for honest self-assessment, they lose the capacity for effective action. I hope my revelation serves as a catalyst for the kind of institutional reform that could prevent future disasters. But first, we need to acknowledge the full scope of what went wrong and accept responsibility for the consequences of our collective dishonesty. The families mourning their loved ones, the veterans struggling with physical and psychological wounds, the Afghan people facing humanitarian catastrophe. They all deserve better than the convenient lies we told ourselves for 20 years. They deserve the truth, however painful it might be. The classified documents I discovered contain names, dates, and specific details that I cannot reveal, without compromising ongoing intelligence operations and potentially endangering lives. But I can tell you that the scope of deception extends far beyond what I've described here. There were parallel deception campaigns running simultaneously with Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, the same institutional mechanisms that distorted Afghanistan reporting were active in multiple theaters. The Pentagon developed what internal documents called narrative management protocols that were applied systematically across all major military operations. One particularly disturbing document outlined contingency plans for managing public perception in the event of catastrophic failure. These weren't plans for preventing failure, they were plans for spinning failure as success or unavoidable tragedy. The evacuation chaos we witnessed was actually one of the better case scenarios they had planned for. The drone program statistics were equally manipulated. For years, we reported surgical precision and minimal civilian casualties. Internal assessments showed civilian casualty rates that were 10 to 15 times higher than publicly acknowledged numbers. We knew innocent people were dying, but admitting this would have undermined public support for the broader strategy. The training programs for Afghan security forces were perhaps the most cynical aspect of our deception. We continued funding and expanding these programs long after internal assessments concluded they were fundamentally ineffective. Billions of dollars were spent training soldiers who would either defect, desert, or surrender at the first opportunity. I found evidence of at least 12 separate occasions where field commanders requested permission to halt training operations because they were actively strengthening Taliban forces through defection and equipment transfer. These requests were denied because stopping the programs would have required acknowledging their failure. The poppy eradication campaigns were equally fraudulent. We spent billions attempting to destroy opium production while simultaneously protecting the very networks that profited from drug trafficking because they provided intelligence and local security. Our own reports showed that opium production increased every year of our intervention. Our own intelligence agencies concluded that our prolonged military presence actually accelerated terrorist recruitment and operational sophistication. We created a training ground where multiple generations of fighters developed expertise in asymmetric warfare against advanced military technology. The veteran suicide crisis that has emerged from this conflict represents another dimension of the human cost of our institutional dishonesty. Service members who understood the gap between public narratives and battlefield realities have struggled with profound moral injury that extends far beyond traditional combat trauma. When soldiers know that their sacrifices are being misrepresented and their missions are based on false premises, the psychological impact can be devastating. The veteran suicide rate from Afghanistan veterans exceeds combat casualties, representing a hidden cost of our systematic deception. The families of fallen service members were consistently told that their loved ones died, pursuing achievable objectives in service of vital national interests. Many of these families now understand that their loved ones died pursuing objectives that senior leadership knew were impossible to achieve. This betrayal of trust extends beyond individual families to the broader social contract between military personnel and civilian leadership. When that trust is broken through systematic deception, it undermines the foundation of civil-military relations in a democratic society. The congressional oversight that was supposed to prevent these failures was consistently undermined by the same information management systems that distorted internal Pentagon assessments. Committee members received briefings based on sanitized reports rather than access to unfiltered intelligence. The few occasions when congressional representatives requested access to classified details were typically met with claims that such access would compromise ongoing operations or intelligence sources. This classification system became a tool for preventing oversight rather than protecting legitimate security interests. The media coverage of the conflict was similarly constrained by limited access to accurate information. Reporters embedded with military units saw carefully managed portions of the overall picture, while comprehensive assessments remained classified and unavailable to independent analysis. The result was 20 years of public discourse based on fundamentally inaccurate information. The American people were asked to support a massive military commitment based on assessments that senior leadership knew were false or misleading. This systematic deception represents a profound failure of democratic accountability. In a functional democracy, major military commitments should be based on honest assessments of costs, benefits, and likely outcomes. When institutions systematically distort this information, democratic decision-making becomes impossible. The institutional reforms necessary to prevent similar failures would require fundamental changes to military promotion systems, intelligence, assessment protocols, and congressional oversight mechanisms. Without these changes, we will likely repeat similar mistakes in future conflicts. As I conclude this revelation, I want to emphasize that this isn't just about Afghanistan. The institutional mechanisms that created this disaster remain in place and continue to influence how we assess current and future national security challenges. The courage to tell these truths comes with significant personal and professional risks, but the cost of continued silence is measured in American lives, international credibility, and democratic accountability. We owe the truth to those who served, those who died, and those who will be asked to serve in future conflicts. The Afghan files represent more than just a military failure. They represent a failure of institutional integrity that undermines the foundation of effective governance. In a democratic society, until we develop the courage to confront these uncomfortable truths, we will continue to repeat tragic mistakes that cost lives and damage our nation's credibility. What do you think? Should military leaders be held personally accountable for systematic deception that costs lives? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to follow for more revelations that could change how you see America's military interventions.